You don't seem very fiery to me. You
I
seem
get
like you
crazy.
might just...
I get crazy.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
You don't want to set me off.
A well-known Hollywood family, a sudden incident inside a private home, and a son whose mental health history is now central to a criminal case. Authorities have made it clear this was not treated as a random situation, but they have also avoided offering simple explanations. Public records point to recent changes in treatment. Court filings raise questions about mental responsibility, and official statements leave critical details deliberately undefined. Behind the headlines, this is not just a legal case. It's a story unfolding at the intersection of family, mental health, and the justice system. So what exactly led to this moment? And why are officials being so precise and so cautious about what they say next? Because in this case, understanding what came before may be just as important as understanding the moment everything changed. What we know is that this case centers around Nick Reiner, the adult son of filmmaker Rob Reiner. Because of his family's public profile, the situation quickly drew national attention, but investigators have been clear about one thing from the beginning. This case is not being handled as a celebrity matter. According to authorities, standard legal procedure is guiding every step, and that procedure begins with understanding who Nick Reiner is, not in terms of public image, but in terms of medical history and legal responsibility. Court records and reporting indicate that his personal background is not incidental to the case. It is central to it. This is not simply a matter of what happened, but of how the legal system must evaluate a person whose mental health history is now directly relevant to the investigation. And from the court's perspective, that distinction changes everything, because before any conclusions can be reached, officials must first determine how this case is meant to be processed and under what legal framework it can move forward. Publicly available information indicates that Nick Reiner has been under psychiatric care for many years. Multiple reports state that he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a condition that can involve disruptions in perception, mood, and thought processes. According to sources familiar with the case, his treatment history spans a long period and includes several different approaches. These reportedly involved inpatient care during more acute phases, outpatient programs aimed at long-term stability, and extended periods of supervision intended to manage symptoms over time. Family members have been described as actively involved throughout this process. Accounts suggest that efforts were repeatedly made to provide care, structure, and support, even as challenges persisted. What remains unclear and central to the investigation is how effective that treatment was in the period leading up to the incident. There has been no public confirmation regarding his mental state in the days or weeks immediately before events unfolded. Officials have also not detailed whether any warning signs were formally documented or whether concerns had been raised by medical professionals during that time. And this uncertainty matters because in cases where mental health history intersects with criminal proceedings, the question is not only what treatment existed, but how it was functioning when it mattered most. That unanswered question now sits at the core of how this case will continue to move forward. One of the most critical details to emerge in this case involves reported changes in medication and treatment. According to court-related reporting and publicly available information, adjustments were made relatively shortly before the incident that led to the criminal investigation. These changes have not been described in detail by authorities, and no medical conclusions have been presented publicly. However, the timing itself has become significant. Defense representatives have indicated that these treatment adjustments may have affected Nick Reiner's mental state during that period. This claim is not being presented as a definitive explanation, but as a question the court is now required to examine carefully. In legal terms, timing matters. Courts must consider not only what changes occurred, but when they occurred, and whether those changes coincided with shifts in behavior, perception, or decision-making. Here, the reported overlap between treatment adjustments and the incident has drawn particular attention. It introduces a layer of complexity that moves the case beyond a straightforward legal framework. Because if treatment was altered shortly before events unfolded, the court must determine whether that timing had any meaningful impact, and whether it affects how responsibility is evaluated under the law. At this stage, officials have not confirmed what conclusions, if any, have been reached, but this overlap in timing remains one of the most closely examined elements of the case, and one that may influence how the proceedings continue from this point forward. Multiple sources report that the family attended a private social gathering the evening before the incident. According to publicly available accounts, the event was described as routine and social in nature, involving familiar faces in a relaxed setting. However, reporting indicates that during the gathering, a disagreement took place involving Nick Reiner and his parents. Details about the disagreement remain limited, but sources describe it as serious enough that his parents chose to leave the event earlier than planned. What is not publicly known is how that interaction concluded. There has been no confirmation of whether the disagreement was resolved, paused, or left unresolved altogether. Officials have not released information indicating what was said, what emotions were involved, or whether the exchange raised concerns at the time. What is known is the timing. Less than 24 hours later, authorities became involved in a situation that moved quickly beyond a private family matter and into a formal criminal investigation. That narrow window between the reported disagreement and the involvement of law enforcement has drawn attention precisely because of how little is publicly understood about it. And in cases like this, the hours leading up to an incident often matter as much as the incident itself, because context is built not only on actions, but on moments that precede them, moments that may later take on greater significance as the investigation continues. The following day, a family member arrived at the home and contacted emergency services. According to official statements, the call was placed after concerns arose upon entering the residence and realizing something was seriously wrong. Emergency responders were dispatched to the scene. Officials later confirmed that by the time they arrived, no medical intervention was possible. At that point, law enforcement assumed control of the situation. The home was secured, access was restricted, and the matter was no longer treated as a medical emergency. It had become an investigative one. Shortly afterward, Nick Reiner was taken into custody in connection with the case. Authorities did not immediately release detailed information about the circumstances surrounding that decision, citing the early stage of the investigation. What is clear is that this moment marked a turning point. Up until then, the situation had unfolded as a private family crisis. From that point forward, it entered the formal structure of the criminal justice system, procedures were initiated, evidence was preserved, and decisions began to be made not only with urgency, but with long-term legal consequences in mind. And once that line was crossed, there was no returning to a purely personal explanation for what had occurred. Another unusual development followed shortly after the early court proceedings. Reports confirmed that Nick Reiner's high-profile attorney withdrew from the case just days before a scheduled hearing. No detailed explanation was provided publicly at the time. There were no allegations, no statements about disagreement, and no indication that the withdrawal was tied to new evidence. What was confirmed is that the court moved quickly to ensure continuity. A public defender was temporarily assigned to represent him while the situation was reassessed. This shift immediately raised questions, not about the facts of the case, but about how complex the legal strategy might be becoming behind the scenes. In cases that involve mental health evaluations, changes in legal representation are not uncommon. As psychiatric assessments evolve, legal approaches often need to adjust accordingly. Different attorneys may specialize in different phases of such cases, from early procedural matters to competency evaluations to long-term trial strategy. At this stage, officials have not indicated whether the public defender will remain in place permanently or whether another private attorney may step in later. What is clear is that this change marked another pause in forward momentum, not a reversal, not a breakdown, but a recalibration. And in a case already shaped by medical and legal complexity, even procedural shifts like this can signal that the path ahead will not be straightforward. What makes this case stand out is not only what has happened, but how cautiously authorities are choosing to proceed. From the outset, officials have limited what they share publicly. There have been only brief statements. No detailed timelines have been released, and no speculative commentary has come from law enforcement or prosecutors. This level of restraint is not accidental. It suggests that investigators and prosecutors are acutely aware that every decision in this case may set precedent, not only legally, but ethically. Cases that involve questions of criminal responsibility alongside serious mental health conditions require a different level of scrutiny. Authorities must balance the need for accountability with the obligation to ensure that mental health factors are evaluated fairly and accurately. Releasing incomplete information too early could influence public perception, affect witness testimony, or complicate psychiatric evaluations that are still underway. It could also create expectations that the legal process may not ultimately support. That is why progress in this case has appeared measured and deliberate, not because of uncertainty, but because precision matters. In situations like this, the justice system is tasked not only with determining what happened, but with deciding how responsibility should be understood within the framework of mental health. And that is a process that cannot be rushed. At its core, this case raises questions that go far beyond a single household or a single courtroom. It forces the justice system to confront how individuals with severe mental illness are evaluated when their actions become part of a criminal investigation. Where does legal responsibility begin? And where does medical treatment factor in? How should courts courts weigh documented mental health histories against the need for accountability, and what happens when deeply private family struggles, often managed quietly for years, are suddenly examined under public and legal scrutiny. These are not questions with simple answers. They do not fit neatly into headlines or timelines. They require careful consideration, expert evaluation, and decisions that may influence how similar cases are handled in the future. Because the outcome of this case will not only affect the individuals directly involved, it may also shape how the legal system approaches the intersection of mental health and responsibility going forward. And that is why this case continues to be watched so closely, not just for what the court decides, but for what those decisions ultimately represent. At this stage, the case exists between confirmed facts and unresolved evaluations. What is known comes from court filings, medical history, and procedural updates. What remains unknown will depend on expert assessments that are still underway. This story is not just about a single incident. It is about how mental health, family responsibility, and the legal system intersect under pressure, and how difficult those intersections can be to navigate fairly. As the process continues, attention will shift away from speculation and toward carefully reviewed conclusions. Because in cases like this, outcomes are shaped not by headlines, but by evidence, expert analysis, and judicial standards. In the next video, we'll focus on one specific element of this case, and why it may ultimately determine how everything else unfolds. If you want to understand where this case could be heading, that's where we'll continue the story.